Hi, everyone. Welcome to stage three. We are having a great day today. I hope you enjoy the first talk. And now I'm going to introduce you, Ryan, from Spendesk. Is going to talk about the journey to API as a product. So, welcome, Ryan. Thank you very much for sharing all this information with us.
Thank you very much for having me. Super excited to be part of API Days, but virtually with interface. So first time doing it virtually. So
Thank
hopefully it
you
all
very
goes
much.
well.
It's gonna go very well. I'll leave you the stage for you. Thank you for everything for everyone. We're gonna have a 5 minutes question in the end. The talk is gonna be around 25 minutes. So write all your question in the chat, and I'll look at them and I'll ask them to Ryan at the end of the talk. Thank you very much, and the stage is yours.
Great, thank you. And I look forward to any questions, especially hard, challenging ones. I would love to hear any of the problems that you're facing and how we can maybe come up with some solutions live on the spot now. So yeah, hi, I'm Ryan Clifford. I'm Group Product Manager for Platform here at Spendesk. So focusing really on APIs and integrations. And today I want to talk about that journey to APIs as a product. So the agenda today, I want to share a little bit around some guiding principles that I've used before and used today, and then really jump into frameworks, checklists, and lessons that I've learned across a number of different lenses. So looking at when you're in the design stage, the building phase, the launching phase, and then managing an API as a product through its life cycle. Then at the end, just wrapping up with a few ways that you might look to adapt those frameworks to your organization. So I do have a quick slide to tell you who I am. So I'm Ryan Clifford, as I mentioned, Group Product Manager at Spendesk for Platform. I have worked basically on developer platforms, APIs, dev portals, dev experience now for a good number of years. This is actually my fourth platform. I previously worked at Barclays, Finastra, Fiserv, and Spendesk, so all within financial institutions or payments or financial technology, building out these types of dev portals and APIs. And what's interesting is I've seen a number of different variations of how you go to market with APIs and how you build it. And what's nice is as you start to see different organizations and how it works, you start to build up these frameworks, which can be quite industry agnostic. So a lot of mine are finance based, or all of them are, but the framework I think for APIs and dev portals is industry agnostic, and you can then tweak it based off of where your needs are. So very quick disclaimer, I am 4 months into this brand new role at at Spendesk, and it's a new platform. So I don't have as many visuals and examples as I would like to share. So instead, I'm going to focus a bit more on outlining the kind of frameworks, checklists, any of the lessons that I've learned to hopefully give you some actionable takeaways that you can try and implement in your own API journeys that you're on. So some guiding principles that have been some great ones in many of the organizations that I've been in when we've tried to accelerate this whole API and platform journey is first looking at APIs as products. And I know that sounds obvious, especially for this track, but APIs are not just interfaces or connectors anymore. They are products and they should be treated like them. And you have companies who are just solely an API product. So what that means is really thinking through the life cycle of an API and treating it like a product in terms of all the different rituals that you'd have in place. And then second is thinking about that technical persona. So developers, and they are vital in today's world in that you no longer just have a business persona, but technical personas make decisions, and it's really important to have them bought in to the entire process. So I really talk about developer experience in everything I talk about now. So it's not just user experience, it's user experience and developer experience. And the third thing is kind of don't underestimate what needs to happen to build an API platform, but also don't overestimate what it takes to get started and to test. Really, it's the principle of let's start small and be nimble and learn as we go, instead of waiting to have the perfect platform, because you won't have a perfect platform, but we can strive for excellence instead. So I'm going to dive into some examples and frameworks and try and bring some of these principles alive. So the way I'm going to look at this is against a couple different buckets of categories. So you've got design as a phase, you've got build, you've got launch, and you've got managing it as a life cycle. So the first one, I'm going to look at the API design process. So this has been built off of a number of different roles that I've seen and done where I've been implementing APIs. And to get to a state where we have APIs as products, we came up with a bit of a framework where it's a process that we go through step by step. And I'm going to give you a load of this at quite high level and then do little deep dives where necessary. So these steps that I've got here are what I would class as very much the designing steps. So we would always start off with reviewing any guidelines or standards that we have when it comes to APIs. And I actually will show you what some of those guidelines look like. And then if you're working on a new API, start with defining the purpose of that API, just like you would with any product, you do it with an API as well. So coming up with what you're trying to achieve, what's the intention of it, and understanding who that customer is and understanding their needs. And then that's when you start to move on from that kind of discovery phase of what do they want to then looking at, well, what capabilities do we have? So exploring whether you have any existing APIs. So I've been focusing a lot on how do you externalize APIs to the public world, but you also have internal APIs in organizations. So exploring existing APIs is looking at your external ones, but equally, do you have any internal capabilities and APIs that may not be perfect, but are a good starting block? And then as you start to build out your kind of catalog of APIs, also thinking about, are there any reusable data models that cut across multiple APIs? Because essentially, if you're building out a platform with many APIs, you want them to look consistent so that you've got an API that maybe exposes some data to an API that might create an action or create a resource or set someone, a new user up, that it looks like it was designed by the same person, or at least it was designed following the same guidelines. So if there's any data models that are common across APIs, you want to reuse them. And that's when the next step is really looking at exploring what you've got and what's existing in terms of data models, and then starting to structure your endpoints. So really jumping into design first with creating an open API specification. And along that, you might use some models that you've got, but you might create some new data models because it might be a new area that you're exploring. As part of that, you really want to map out what is the capability that you're exposing via an API and what's the logic that's involved there. I've worked on a number of APIs where there's a lot of complexity, but that's internal complexity, and a user shouldn't have to deal with that externally. So how can you try to abstract that? And there's some really smart ways of looking at how can you abstract complexity in your API design. So you think, okay, if a user is going to be consuming this API, for example, to create an interface to serve to their customer, say if it's a form and there's certain required fields and not all of them are needed, some are optional, how do you design your API with maybe flags to say, okay, here's an array of items, and what you can do when you're coding, you can just pass through this, and if there's got this flag which says required, you can then tell your UI to show it. So you can think about how you design things to abstract complexity so the user doesn't have to think about additional logic. And then when you get further down this process, you can look at, do you have any linting rules that you're using that you want to apply to all of your APIs? And there's some really good API design tools out there that can start to speed up that process and do part of that work for you. And then actually creating documentation. So throughout all of this, you haven't actually built anything, you haven't developed any code, you've created an open API spec, you started to write down actually what would be the end documentation that a customer will see, and then you can start to take it through to that next phase, which is really starting to validate your design. So mocking that API and validating with clients. So that could be just mocking a quick sandbox experience, or even I've found just sharing that open API spec has been far more useful for a developer to come and look at, as opposed to someone just telling me about use cases or, oh, an API will do X, Y, Z. It's like, let me dive in, have a little look and start asking questions. And from that, you get a ton of feedback, and then that's where you can start iterating. And then the last stage of our process that we've implemented in previous roles is the reviewing stage. So how do you take something through design into, yes, it's ready to then be built. So you can do API design reviews with your own team. I've done that before. You can then, after doing these reviews, or as I sometimes call them, roasting sessions, you either get kind of an approval, or you might get some rework, or you might need to go back to the drawing board. This is an iterative process. And then you can look to publish that API spec, ideally into an early access area. So that's some stuff around just generally the API design process. I wanted to just dive into one example here of the guidelines and standards, and what you can do with each of these buckets is essentially build out details about each of the standards that sit behind this. So when it came to designing an API, having details and examples on kind of all of these areas was really crucial. So looking at what's the standards for your headers, query parameters, path parameters, the verbs that you're using, actually a good understanding of it. Is it a put? Is it a patch? What's the user trying to do? What's the end result? Looking at things like your error messages, your naming conventions, even things like examples that may be common in multiple APIs, and if you can have consistent examples, so that again, if someone's interacting with one API and then they switch to another API, it all looks consistent and they think this is well designed by the same team. And then looking at, are there any ISO formats you want to follow, any industry standards that are specific to your industry, where you go, actually, I'm not going to deviate and create my own design for naming conventions or descriptions or regex or whatever it may be. I'm going to use the industry format because it's widely adopted. So there's loads of things here, and essentially we would have details and examples behind each of these boxes to help people along that journey, especially when you've got people who are potentially fairly new to designing APIs or have designed APIs but only as an interface because it was a connection that was needed and never really thought about it as a product. So moving on, I want to talk about the dev portal journey that goes alongside this, because you've got your API, which I class as the product. In essentially, when you go into a shop, you want that product, but you actually go into a shop, whether it's a physical shop or a virtual shop in today's world, but you have that landing page. And I consider the dev portal part of that experience to access an API. So by the way, none of this is exhaustive in terms of a list of things. It's just things that's top of mind when I'm thinking about it. So I'm going to run through a couple different things that I think about with the dev portal journey. So first of all is looking at the discovery phase of where you're starting and building out that awareness of your API and helping customers with that selection. And some of the things that sit in here will be things like your landing site, your API catalog. So seeing your API references as well would be included here, because if I'm honest, that's one of the things I really want to get to assess whether I even want to spend more time looking at your site. But then you might also have other things that increase discovery of your product or your API. So it could be that you do blogs, articles, or thought leadership on it, and someone comes across that, and that's the way they come into your portal or your platform. You also ideally have case studies or testimonies talking about, the people who have used your APIs and what is it that they've done with it to really provide some inspiration. You might do other traditional things like events or hackathons, obviously, are an obvious one for APIs. And then also thinking about your searchability. So things like, are you listed in the right places? Do you have good search engine optimization? And actually in today's world, what does ChatGPT think of you, and does it get picked up? So it's quite an interesting one there on the discovery side. Now, if I fast forward to onboarding, this is all around, how do I then start to get access? So I figured out you've got an API, I'm interested in using it. So actually, what is that registration flow look like? And is it easy enough for me to get started, or are there barriers in place? Because really, I just want to get an API key and I want to go and test in your sandbox, because an API spec is great, but really I want to see how it reacts. And I want to play a couple of different scenarios out. And then you're really into that build phase and looking at how do I develop, test, and validate what I'm building. And that the API actually fulfills, from a consumer's perspective, fulfills the need. So making sure that you have the right documentation. Documentation is your API reference, is any guides that walks you through the use cases, it's tutorials, which are step-by-step. It could be any dev tools. So even just having a Postman collection can help speed up the time it takes to play around. And then it's looking at SDKs. And then moving on to the production journey, you look at how do I then monitor, look at your change log, keep up to date with SLAs, any deprecation. And there's a few things that cross over when it comes to multiple categories here, like how can I test lots of different scenarios to make sure I build the right integration with your API? How do I provide support across the life cycle? And also, what does a developer community mean, and how does it support all of these items? But to be honest, the developer community is a whole separate talk in itself, because there's so much that can happen there. So I'm going to move on to build now, and a few quick lessons that I've learned when it's come to building. So as I mentioned before, build small and validate quick. So basically, try and get that process of feedback and that iteration to be as quick as possible, because you don't want to go down the wrong route too quickly. So that's where mocking up some stuff in a sandbox environment can be really good. And then you want to have a look at how can you design API specs first before kind of developing too much. So there can be debates, and I've had it, about do you design specs first or do you generate specs from code? My own experience in a few different organizations, we've probably had more benefit on designing specs first, because you can validate it before you build anything, and it's been a little bit quicker to pull up something. And then also looking at, when it comes to building, looking at how can you leverage anything that's shared workflows in your gateway, whatever API gateway you might use, or how you deal with it. Are there any code generators that you can use with that really nicely designed open API spec to speed up some of your development? And actually, are there any policies that either are pre-existing, either in your gateway or you've used before in other APIs that are kind of applicable to all of your APIs? Again, and just speeding up, getting into an industrialized process of building APIs. I would also then call out trying to think quite creatively and pragmatically about how do you create sandbox experiences. If you don't have a full demo environment, how can you maybe simulate or stub a sandbox experience to kind of fake it till you make it a little bit, but at least it fulfills the need. So there are certain things you can do which are quite hacky ways, but they serve a good purpose. Especially if you want to kind of move quite quickly in this space. Then there's also looking at incorporating feedback into your mock designs of open API specs, which I mentioned before. Very important, I think, just for speed. And then also leveraging what you have internally. So really look at existing APIs and where can you abstract complexity and start building as soon as. Now, if I move into launching, there's a few items, and again, it's not exhaustive, but a few things that come to mind when I think around launching your API to market. So thinking about actually what's the process of going from maybe an alpha API to beta to general availability, and actually what are these stages, and who are you communicating to, and how can you stage it so you're sharing as much as possible as early as possible. And then looking at collateral. So it's not just about documentation. Yes, you want your open API spec, you want some good guides, tutorials, but also think about, can some videos help to articulate the real use case for this API? Can additional articles or testimonies, or having just like how-tos or checklists really help speed up how someone, whether they're technical, maybe on the business side, trying to really assess, is this the right route to go down, can pick up a lot of information about your API very quickly. Then there's also, as I've mentioned before, treating an API like a product. So if you're launching a product, you would kind of set up a launch plan. So do the same for an API. There's obviously, you need to adapt it. It's not quite the same as a typical product. You might find that, one, your audience is different. It's typically developers. So understanding what's the key thing that you really are trying to launch or communicate. And sometimes it's, actually, we have a new version, and what does that mean? So yes, there's explaining the benefits of and why you want to move across to the new version, but you might also cover elements in your launch around what does this mean for existing older version, and what does deprecation look like then if someone's moving across from one API to another. So there's some nuances with launching APIs which you maybe wouldn't quite have with a traditional product. And then there's sales enablement. So really looking at if you've got a sales or a revenue organization or customer success and you're launching an API, how are they upskilled to talk about that API? Do they have the basics of even what an API is? Or do they get it confused when you start to talk about REST versus GraphQL versus what an integration is and what the end user journey is? So really thinking about upskilling your organization in APIs. And then trying to try it out and actually run demos. So I love having try it out features, super easy to get started, ideally without even having to log in, even having a demo to really bring to life. If I use this API to integrate, what is the end result? So what am I trying to do? It's really a jobs to be done framework approach. And if you can create a demo which shows what an end customer would use this API for, it's a really nice way of articulating the value. And lastly, continuous feedback, as I've mentioned before, it's so critical. So lastly, if I just move on to manage and some quick lessons I've experienced here when it comes to managing APIs, there's one thing that some people can get stuck in is that they've launched an API and they think that's it, I'm done. It's a connector, it's out there, I don't need to do anything else. But really you need to continually expand both the features in that API, but also your broader capabilities across. If you take your capabilities across your value chain, across whatever industry is, how can you expose APIs at all of these various points of your value chain? And it's a continuous journey. And then looking at how can you add features to your APIs to increase the experience and improve it. One example that I've seen before is looking at kind of taking inspiration from kind of the Hatios linking aspects to look at if I am using a number of different endpoints and say if it's data and I want to know how do these data points all connect together, maybe I can use linking so I can programmatically say, okay, I'm playing around with an authorization for a payment. How do I know what it's linked to when it comes to a transaction that's actually settled and funded? And how do you create this ideally automated, programmatically coded journey instead of just using documentation to explain it? So yes, you need documentation, but trying to do it with code as well is a good way of doing it. And then also constantly running holistic quality checks. You'll be very surprised, and I've been and my team's been surprised in the past where we thought we did a really, really good job, and then a month down the line or 2 months, we've gone back and reviewed that API and we've spotted a few little things which are inconsistent with other APIs, and we thought we were on top of it. But the reality is, if you're on an API journey, your standards are living and breathing and changing as you learn more information. So the next slide I've got is just to share some of those quality check things that I would look out for. So we used to look at have we updated our Postman collection to reflect there's been some changes with how we use Postman or the examples, or has it got the most up-to-date endpoints? Have we updated the change log? It's just an obvious one. It's quite easy to miss sometimes, but making sure we're on top of that. Make sure our guides and documentation follow a really nice, simple format, and it's quite consistent. So if I'm playing around with one endpoint and the guides for that, I move to another one. Even the documentation looks like it's consistently built by the same type of people. Looking at your API standards. So at the beginning, when I shared a load of standards and guidelines, has that changed? Have we decided that we're introducing a new data model and it's impacting others? Really keeping on top of our standards there. Then looking at things like your product pages, error handling, make sure your error messages are consistent across APIs. Your roadmap items are updated and managed. Your naming conventions stay consistent. I can get very specific on naming conventions. Making sure that any of your technical settings, whether it's rate limiting or restrictions, are all kind of consistent. And if you've learned something on one API, you've applied it to another. And that authentication is consistent across the board as well, and how that can change over time. So very last slide, which is just about how you can adapt all of these different frameworks to your organization. Some things that I would think about is, how is your organization going to develop APIs? Is it going to be a distributed model where lots of different engineering domains are working on it? Or are you going to have a centralized team? Or are you going to have a variation of that? So you can make sure that you have some level of consistency when you expose these APIs. Thinking about what your customer needs, whether it's an integration or an API, or what your organization needs. needs. So your customer might not want to do any coding and just wants a UI to enable a integration. So actually you need to be building something, versus they actually might want to build it themselves, and that's where they need an API. Equally, thinking about your organization, how you scale, can you just do all of the integrations yourself, or is building an API are going to allow you to scale and connect into more tools in the ecosystem in the future? Looking at cross-functional skills and whether you might want one kind of big platform team that has a lot of different skill sets, or whether you're going to be kind of a cross-functional team where you're going to have marketing involved, product, engineering, sales enablement, and it's spread out and distributed across the organization. Trying to map out your target operating model for a platform, and actually how does that differ to other target operating models for maybe your standard business, and especially if you're transitioning from a more standard traditional business into an API platform. The engagement can be a little bit different when it comes to new products, approval for an API versus other types of products. And then lastly, thinking about the direction of travel and where you want to go in the future and that evolution. And a journey I'm sort of on is I started with APIs as a product, which is kind of more this talk, but the next evolution is really looking at platforms a little bit more holistically, and then trying to figure out what ecosystems look like for your specific company. So I will leave it there, and thank you for your time, and I'll welcome any questions, or if you want to connect afterward.
Thank you, Ryan. It was very, very clear and a very detailed presentation. It was very interesting. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions right now because we are running a bit late. But you have the contact of Ryan. You can contact him in LinkedIn and ask him the questions yourself. Thank you very much. Again, it was a very, very cool talk.